Hello everybody. So we are starting a new module today. If you managed to pick up a copy of the booklet, it's bright green. If you didn't, then you've got two versions. One of them is a scanned copy, which means you get every single page, but the quality is not brilliant. And then the other version is the electronic copy, which has got everything that we write as a department, but none of the photocopied stuff that comes from other places. But between the two of them, it should at least give you something to be working with at home. Okay, so today we're just going to introduce it, set the scene. Not even a page number. The back of the front cover is a glossary. So if I ever use a word and you think, I don't really know what that means, maybe the glossary will help you. Page 1 and the very top of page 2 is the syllabus. It's what the exam board say we need to teach you for this module, and it might just give you a nice framework. Some of you are going to find this module really straightforward because you probably will have done quite a lot of coasts at GCSE, in which case it's about half revision and about half new information. If you haven't done coasts before, please don't panic. We will teach you everything that you need to know. What I do have to apologise for is that because I had to get this module ready in a little bit of a rush because of current circumstances, I forgot to give you a list of case studies. So they're on the screen. What you might want to do is to pause the video and just jot those down. We'll talk about case studies as we go through the module in the videos and when we see you again, but they are those, so I apologise for that. Okay, on page 2 then, what we would normally have done to introduce this module is I would have got you into pairs or small groups, and you would have thought about the questions on page 2. What do you think the coast is? How would you define it? Why is it important, and why does it change? What might be a nice activity is for you to pause the video and actually have a think about those questions to yourself. If things are really boring at home, then have a family chat about it. That might give you something to do if you're socially isolating like we are at the moment. Anyway, these are 3 different definitions of what the coast is. You can pick whichever one you like. I quite like the middle one. I think the first one's a little bit too basic. I think the third one's a bit too wordy. I quite like the one in the middle. The narrow interface between the land and the sea. Why is it important? Well, this is by no means an exhaustive list, but the coast is seriously important, and actually the majority of the world's population live near the coast. It's a phenomenally important environment, but what actually we're most interested in A-level geography is this. The fact that coastlines are dynamic, they're changing constantly. You've got waves and tides and sea level change and tsunamis and landslides and human management and blah, blah, blah. There's just so much going on. And really what we do in this module is we talk a lot about change and why they change and how they change. Okay, so sorry that that's not a very interactive activity at the moment, but that just sets the scene. Things that you probably already know, just to set the scene, we're going to talk about sea level change in this module. So we're going to talk about the fact that in the last ice age, the north of the UK was covered in ice and the south of the UK wasn't. But because there was so much water trapped in the ice, sea levels were approximately 140 metres lower than they are today. There was no North Sea, so the North Sea is here, that didn't exist. There was no English Channel, you could have walked between those countries of Europe. That's obviously a significant change. We also know that currently sea levels are rising because of ice melt and climate change, so that's going to be a constant source. Coastal erosion, this is a kind of spot the difference of how many houses have been lost kind of thing. Coastal erosion is a serious problem. We lose houses, we lose businesses, etc. Dubai has an interesting plan for their coastline. They ran out of coastal property. Everyone likes a coastal property. So they are creating extra coastlines, including, I don't know if you've ever seen this map of the world made out of islands that they've built. Humans change coastlines a lot. This is a type of management called beach nourishment, where you artificially add sand. If you've ever been to Lyme Regis, they have done that, but this is Miami, Florida. Slightly more exotic, you might argue. And for those of you that want to, there are a few YouTube videos that you could watch about tsunamis and other forms of change. Okay, bit of revision then for the second part of today's video. Page 3, we have talked about systems quite a lot in the water and carbon cycle module, and I'm not going to insult your intelligence by reminding you of all of that. I'm going to say just a couple of things. Systems have inputs, outputs, stores and processes. That's very important to remember. But crucially, if you change one part of a system, you will have knock-on effects for the rest of that system. That's kind of the significance of that idea. So here we have Durdledor, which is on the south coast of the UK. And within that section of coastline, this behaves as a system. And if one of the inputs changes, so for example, there's a huge input of energy in the form of a storm, you might begin to see more coastal erosion and so on and so forth. So it might be a good opportunity to do a little bit of revision of systems. Now, the good bit of news, potentially, when we did carbon and water cycles, you do need to learn the different sections. So you need to learn, for example, that precipitation is the only input to the water cycle, and then you've got outputs like evapotranspiration, etc. You don't have to learn all of them for coast because there are actually kind of too many. Inputs, I've put a few examples, and then I've put etc, etc, because I could go on and on and on. Processes, this is probably quite familiar territory for some of you, and they form quite a big part of the module. So we will learn about different types of erosion, different types of mass movement and so on. We don't list all the stores because there's too many, but I've given a couple of examples if you want to jot them down. And the output of a coastal system are the landforms. So that is an arch, Durdledor, and that is an output from the coastal system. All right, so yeah, systems continue to be super important, but we don't actually have to learn every single aspect of them for coast, just because it would be too much for our little brains to process. So the last thing we're going to do today, just to set the scene, is a little bit of terminology. This is at the bottom of page 3. At GCSE, I imagine, and I am making an assumption here, apologies if it's wrong, you really just talk about coastlines. Well, when we did Changing Places, we said, well, actually, you can't just talk about rural and urban areas because that's too simplistic. You need to talk about the CBD and inner city, etc, etc. Well, we're back to that kind of level of detail. We actually divide coastlines into 4 sections, okay? Backshore, foreshore, nearshore, offshore. And what I'm going to try to do, as best I can, as the last part of today's video, is explain the difference. Right, so the backshore is at the back of the beach. Brilliant. Okay, so it's from the high tide line. How do you find a high tide line? Well, there will be a line of debris on your beach. Unfortunately, I have to admit that these days that line is probably going to be lots of rubbish. Here you can see it can be entirely natural, like seaweed. So you will be able to find the high tide line on the beach. So that's the start of the backshore. And then it goes as far inland as the sea reaches. So on a beach like this, it's pretty obvious that the sea is not going to get past those cliffs. So the backshore would go from the high tide line to those cliffs. On other coastlines, it's fairly obvious that the sea during extreme storms probably comes much further inland. And so the backshore would actually potentially be much bigger. They are not going to make it that complicated in the exam, all right, as long as you know the definition. So it's from the high tide line as far inland as the sea reaches, which if you've got cliffs is fairly obvious. Right, foreshore. So the foreshore sometimes is covered by the sea and sometimes it isn't. The foreshore then is kind of really changeable. It's sometimes covered in water, it sometimes isn't covered in water. Yeah, and that's how you tell. So it's quite nice. It's between the high tide line and the low tide line. All right, so if you find your high tide line, you can find where that is. Wait for the tide to go out. That's the lower point. So that changes a significant amount. Now the other two bits are underwater. So the near shore and offshore are both underwater constantly. All right. The dividing line between the two of them is quite confusing. So the near shore, which can also be called the inshore, I've deliberately put near shore on the diagram and inshore underneath, so it's just the same name. You're underwater, but here what the water is doing will move the sediment on the seabed. Can you see here that as this wave has crashed, all of that sand is moving around. It's being moved by the water. So in the near shore or the inshore, what the water does affects the seabed. You know that you get into the offshore when what the water is doing doesn't really affect the seabed at all. Okay, so this dividing line, this side of it, what the water does affects the seabed. This side of it, what the water does doesn't really affect the seabed. And the reason I like this diagram, because it's nice and clear cut, but the silly thing about it actually is the water should get deeper as you go further and further offshore. All right, so one of the big differences here, the water moving affects the seabed because it's quite shallow. Here, the water moving doesn't really affect the seabed because the waves are such a long way above the seabed. So that is a bit confusing and it does take a little bit of getting used to. Obviously, you can have a Google as well. You don't just have to rely on me. That's it for today. That's as far as we're going to get. But before you move on, sorry, that's my dog. Let me just shut the door. Apologies about that, folks. That's somebody at the door. Before we move on to the next video, if you could just try and make sure that you could answer those questions, a little check on progress. So in your own words, what is the coast? Remind yourself about what a system is and make sure in your own words, with your own understanding, you could clarify these 4 sections of a coastline. You will be good to go for the rest of the module. Okay, so what I would just remind you, any questions, queries you've got, keep your emails coming as you are doing. If you've got any work for me to mark, any changing places questions, email me. Between trying to homeschool my child and various other things, I am checking email as often as I can. Okay, hope you're all safe and well, folks. Bye.